The Houston Texans finished the 2023 season with a 10-7 record and made the playoffs for the first time since 2019. They would go on to beat the Browns with a score of 45-14 before losing to the Ravens in the divisional round of the playoffs. Despite losing by 24 points in the divisional round, it was an insanely successful season for the Texans, all things considered. This was a team that 12 months prior was getting clowned for beating the Colts in Week 18 of the 2022 season, causing them to miss out on the number 1 overall pick. But a lot of things changed in a year. DeMeco Ryans built a culture from the ground up, and they drafted not just one, but two franchise cornerstones in CJ Stroud and Will Anderson, and their offensive coordinator looks to be a future head coach in Bobby Slowick. I don't think anyone could have seen this type of year coming from the Texans, and even in the best case scenario, the thought process was that if everything goes right, they'll win 7, maybe 8 games and have something to build on entering 2024. But they didn't listen to that, and despite starting 0-2, the Texans had one hell of a season and their future is very, very bright. And the question now is, how far can they go this year? Well, we're going to break it down in today's video. Now let's begin. And we are starting today's video by breaking down what the Texans did in free agency, both in terms of who they lost and who they acquired. They lost a few defensive starters in free agency in Jonathan Grenard and Blake Cashman, as both players went to Minnesota. Both guys are solid, and it wasn't going to be easy to replace those guys, but Houston did, which we'll get to in a minute. They also lost defensive tackle Sheldon Rankins, running back Devin Singletary, and veteran tackle George Fant. Those were the main losses for the Texans in free agency this year, and they even lost punter Cameron Johnston, who signed with the Steelers, but the losses for them in free agency, when you factor in who they signed, were minimal. They brought in Danielle Hunter on a 2-year, $49 million contract, with 48 of the 49 being guaranteed, and why I like this signing in particular is because of how good of a player Danielle is, and how little risk it is long term. When you first hear that 48 of the $49 million he signed for is guaranteed, you probably think that's a lot more than how most free agent contracts are structured, and you'd be right. But Danielle's contract is not going to limit what they're going to be able to do moving forward. They're not going to be unable to pay any of their young players, whether it's CJ, Will, Tank, or whoever, simply because they gave him all of this guaranteed money. Not only that, but Danielle is an upgrade from Jonathan Grenard, and being able to get after the quarterback is obviously critical in football, but it's even more amplified in the AFC. Danielle had an 80 pressure season last year and finished 5th in the NFL in sacks with 16.5. He also led the league in tackles for a loss with 23, and despite Danielle having been in the league since 2015, he was the youngest player in the NFL for his entire rookie year, and believe it or not, Danielle is still in his 20s. Granted, he will turn 30 in October of this year, but the point is, there is a very real possibility Danielle can be a 3 or 4 year starter for the Texans if everything goes right. And because of this, I thought losing Grenard ended up being a great outcome for them. The Texans also brought in talented linebacker Azeez Al-Shaair to essentially replace Cashman. I like Azeez a lot, and we went over him during the Titans team preview, but he's a very talented linebacker, and I would expect him to be all over the field for the Texans, like he was for Tennessee last year. And heading into the year, obviously the Texans offense gets a lot of love, and that's going to happen when you have a rookie quarterback have the year CJ Stroud did last year. But the Texans' defense was very good too, and they quietly finished 11th in points per game allowed last year, and I would think, after improving the defense this offseason, that they'll be close to there again. I also really liked the Denico Autry signing for Houston, and Denico is a player who is a good veteran pass rusher who knows his role and will play it well. He is 34 years old, so that is a slight drawback, as there will probably be a decline at some point. Whether that's in 2024 or 2025 is to be determined, but putting Denico inside when you have Will Anderson and Danielle Hunter on the outside is a very favorable situation for any defensive tackle, let alone a guy who's been around for a while and a guy who knows the tricks of the trade, and also a guy who is quietly working on 3 straight seasons with 50 or more pressures. The Texans also signed veteran corner Jeff Okudah, and Okudah was the number 3 overall pick back in the 2020 draft. Jeff has not had a great career, obviously, as he is now on his 3rd team in 5 years, and this is one concern I have with the Texans in 2024, and that's their secondary, specifically at the cornerback position. Houston made a lot of improvements from 2023 to 2024, and that's big for a team that's in the rookie quarterback contract window, and for a team that won 10 games last year. And being able to get after the quarterback with 2 great pass rushers in Will Anderson and Danielle Hunter is huge, but they have to be able to hold up in the back end of the defense, and this is where I have some concerns. Nickel is the new base, as teams are playing with 3 corners on the field more than they ever have to counter the 3 receiver sets opposing offenses use, and I know we've brought it up in other team previews, but this is why corner play is so critical for teams in today's era. It's not enough to have one elite corner, which I think the Texans have in Derek Stingley Jr., and another okay corner that can hold his own. You almost need 2 good or even 2 great corners just to be able to not get exposed on a weekly basis. And the Texans' corners after Stingley are Okudah, nickel Miles Bryant, Mike Ford, and 2nd-round rookie Kamari Lassiter. I think the Texans have done a phenomenal job in terms of rebuilding their football team over the past few years, especially where they were when GM Nick Caserio took over. But I would also ask Texans fans, how do you feel about the secondary entering the year outside of Stingley and Jalen Petrie, of course? Because for as fun as the Texans season was last year at times, they still finished 23rd in passing yards allowed, which is something I would expect to continue this year. Credit where it's due, the Texans' run defense last year was great. They finished 2nd in yards per carry allowed, as opposing teams averaged just 3.5 yards per carry, and they allowed just over 1,600 yards rushing in 17 games. They also had 10 games where they allowed 100 yards or less rushing during the 2023 regular season. What I think is also particularly impressive for the 2023 Texans that I very much expect to carry over in the 2024 is they allowed 100 yards or more rushing in each of the first 4 games last year. And after that, they allowed 100 yards or more as a team just 3 times in the final 13 regular season games. I have zero concerns with how this team is going to play up front, and to be completely honest, I would be pretty surprised if this team doesn't finish in the top 10 in rushing defense for the 2nd straight year. But I also think it's a pretty big gamble to enter the season with how thin the Texans are in the secondary, especially when you play teams outside of your division like the Bills, the Packers, the Jets, the Lions, the Cowboys, and the Chiefs, all of which can pass the football at a high level. But the positive spin for this is, it's not like the Texans are entering the year not knowing their secondary is a weak point on the roster. And there was a reason they spent a combined $69 million between Danielle Hunter and Denico Autry, both of which were nice additions. The positive spin here is there's a very real chance the Texans have 2 players have 65 plus pressures in Danielle Hunter and Will Anderson. Will had 59 pressures in his rookie year, and if he plays all 17 games, I would be shocked if that number goes down, considering he did that as a 22-year-old rookie. Guys get better with time in the trenches, and when you think about Will going up against Laramie Tunsil in practice, and also being able to learn from a vet in Danielle Hunter, the Texans' pass rush is going to be fierce, which in turn will limit how long the DBs have to cover opposing receivers or stay in their zone coverages. Their run defense will also be great, so what the Texans' game plan a lot of the time will be to stop the run and force opposing teams into 3rd and 6 plus situations and let Danielle and Will pin their ears back and get after the quarterback. And despite the concerns I have with the secondary, good luck stopping both of those guys, truly. And as long as the secondary can be serviceable, not elite and certainly not awful, but serviceable, the Texans are going to be a damn good defense. Now, the 2024 Texans offense is very fun to project for several reasons. CJ Stroud, of course, had a great year last year. He threw for over 4,000 yards, he threw for 23 touchdowns, and he only threw 5 interceptions. And when you factor in the offensive line getting healthier, which it should from 23 to 24, as that's somewhat forgotten about with the 2023 Texans season, is despite how good CJ Stroud was, and despite how good Nico Collins' career year was, and even Tank Dell's rookie season before he got hurt, the Texans' offensive line was a revolving door, really outside of a position or two. So when you factor in the offensive line getting more healthy, which again, I don't think they're going to be as injured as they were last year, and when you factor in the receivers playing all 17 games, or at least you would hope, here in late July, and when you also factor in that they acquired Stefon Diggs to help CJ at receiver, and of course Joe Mixon at running back, you can get pretty lofty with the Texans' expectations offensively. Now, there is one thing that we have not addressed in today's video so far that I'm sure a lot of people are wondering about. I released a video a couple of months ago that said the Houston Texans hype train needs to slow down, and I was going to address that. I just didn't want to address it early, but we're addressing it now. So, the main reason for that video and the main preface behind that video was, let's not immediately assume because the Texans got to the divisional round in CJ's rookie year that it is only onward and upward from there, and that we're going to the AFC Championship game this year and that we're going to win the Super Bowl next year. Now, if that happens and CJ becomes a Super Bowl champion quarterback in just his third year, go for it. I'm all for that. But the main preface behind that video was, look, there are countless teams in the AFC that can beat not just the Texans, but can beat anybody on any given Sunday. And it was behind this whole idea that you see a lot of people screaming on social media that let's just fast forward to Texans Chiefs in the AFC Championship game because that's what it's going to be. Can the Texans get there this year? Yes, absolutely. And you would be an idiot to say that before the season starts that there is zero chance that they can get there. So the Texans hype, it is very real. I just don't want to automatically assume. Let's just go ahead and throw out Josh Allen, Joe Burrow, Aaron Rodgers, Lamar Jackson, and everybody else, because Texans Chiefs is already penciled in for the AFC Championship game. Now, pertaining to Nico Collins specifically, he signed an extension this offseason. He went for over 1,300 yards last year. But I would be surprised if he goes for over 1,300 yards again, simply because there are a lot of mouths to feed in this offense. And to be completely honest, whether it's Nico, Stefon, Tank, Dalton Schultz, I think there's going to be a maximum of 2 1,000-yard receivers, and I don't think it's going to be Dalton Schultz. So take your choosing between Stefon Diggs and Tank Dell, because I do think Nico will go for over 1,000 yards last year, and Tank Dell was probably on his way to going for 1,000 yards last year, so we'll see how that plays out. But the expectations for CJ and the Texans this year and Bobby Slowick are understandably lofty. Now, just being honest, for Joe Mixon this year, I would not expect an insane year by any means, and I know Joe just went for over 1,000 yards and even had 9 touchdowns last year, which was good for him, and to be honest, I think he was kind of underrated in the grand scheme of things for running backs in 2023, but we're talking about a 28-year-old running back that has over 1,800 career touches in the NFL, and based on the career touches that he's had, the fall off is coming. Whether it's this year, whether it's next year, I just would not expect Joe Mixon to be a 1,400 or 1,500 total yard player. Now, admittedly, there is one guy on the Texans offense that I really like, and every analyst, every fan, every person has a player that they really, really like, whether it was from a couple of years ago and they hope they make a comeback, or whatever the case may be. And to be honest with you guys, I love Dameon Pierce. Now, I was very frustrated with how Dameon's 2023 season went, and I don't think Dameon is going to, be ahead of Joe Mixon on the depth chart, and I don't think Dameon's going to rush for over 1,000 yards this year by any means, but I think it's going to be split more than people probably think, especially with Mixon coming off of that 1,000-yard year. And not only that, but what also hurt Dameon last year, and even Devin Singletary for that matter too, was the average yards per carry due to how many offensive linemen the Texans were constantly rotating. So by having the health along the Texans offensive line, that should only increase the Texans average yards per carry, which was a paltry 3.7 yards as a team last year. To be completely honest, I would be very surprised if the Texans do not finish this year in either the top 8 or 9 in offensive points per game. Now, for the 2024 rookie impact for the Texans, we are going to break that down with fellow Texans fan Brett Coleman. If you guys were wondering why the Texans preview was a couple of weeks after the other AFC South teams, it's because Brett and I's schedule didn't align until now, so hopefully the wait was worth it. But without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the Brett Coleman interview. All right, we now welcome on a very special guest to the channel. It is Texans fan Brett Coleman. Brett, how are we doing?
I'm doing great. It's camp season, so I'm getting ready for the madness of the next 6 months straight. I don't know about you. I kind of have a policy where I don't release much in June and July, but I just work on stuff in that period because that's when I feel like a lot of people go away and they don't care as much about football. And then 4th of July happens and there's a trickle, and then camp season opens, and all of a sudden everybody cares. And so that's when I start trying to release stuff again. So should have a lot coming out pretty soon here.
I feel that. I actually have a book right here. I read a lot during the off season. I'm always like trying to like learn more the offensive manuals, from Bobby. But no, the first question that I wanted to ask regarding the Texans was, outside of CJ Stroud, just because I feel like that's kind of a caveat answer, which player are you most looking forward to seeing in 2024?
I would probably say off the top of my head, either Derek Stingley or Nico Collins, because Stingley, when he's been healthy, especially last year, when he got back healthy, he was one of the best ball hawks in the league. Was starting to emerge as that top level corner that they drafted when they took him, in the top, I think it was 5th overall, whatever the pick they spent on him was super high. And he was an elite prospect coming out, and struggled with injury early in his career. But when he's been on the field, especially lately, he was looking like legitimately a peer to Sauce Gardner. And this team got a lot of criticism for taking Stingley over Sauce, especially now seeing what Sauce has become. So I'm looking forward to see if Stingley can kind of build on the back half of last year and be that top 5 corner in the NFL that they thought they were getting when they drafted him. And then Nico Collins, I'm really interested to see how he fits. Not that he doesn't fit, more so I should say, if he can still be the true, unquestioned number 1 on this team with the addition of Stephon Diggs, with obviously Tank Dell still being there as a high-end number 3, Dalton Schultz being Stroud's favorite red zone target. We also anticipate this to be a pretty run-heavy team if they were having their way. So with all these weapons and with what should be a strong run game, I'm very curious to see if he still kind of maintains that top 10 receiver type production. Not that he's not capable of it, but a lot of mouths to feed here. So those are probably the two young storylines that I'm looking forward to the most.
So within the Nico Collins answer, you mentioned the run game, and obviously we know Bobby Slowick comes from San Francisco, and obviously San Francisco has had, the coaching tree has had quite the impact over not just the past couple of years, but the entire NFL. And do you worry about the Texans' run game in 24, or do you think it's kind of going to take care of itself due in large part to just how many injuries they sustained last year?
They were really banged up on the offensive line to start the year. They had like 80% of their starting offensive line didn't even play in September, right? And the fact that they still were a functional offense despite all those injuries was kind of a miracle, especially with a rookie quarterback. As their offensive line got healthier throughout the year, we started to see the run game pop a little bit more. Dameon Pierce kind of disappointed me, I'm not going to lie, but luckily they had Devin Singletary there, who's always been one of my favorite underrated running backs in the league, breaking tackles like crazy. So what I'm hoping for is that the offensive line just stays healthy. I'm hoping that we finally get the interior trio play that they've been hoping to get for the last 3 years straight and investing a whole bunch of resources in the guard center guard trio. I'm hoping that we finally get that level of play compared to the tackles, which were clearly the strongest part of the offensive line. I'm trying to be diplomatic about it, as you can tell.
I got you. No, I got you.
But clearly this offensive line, the bread was buttered by Laramie Tunsil and by Titus Howard at tackle. I'm really curious to see, especially with the changes they're making in personnel, if the guard center guard trio can just not die.
Right, stay healthy. Right.
Yeah. And I think that's going to go a long way towards helping Joe Mixon, as old as he is and as many miles have been put on that engine. I'm hoping that can kind of give him one last great season before the unfortunate running back cliff comes for him too.
That is, well, there is full transparency. There is like a part of the video that I do before the interview, and that is one thing that I mentioned. But you even mentioned Dameon Pierce. I was a little disappointed with him as well. I liked him a lot coming out of Florida, and I am hoping that Kenyon Green comes back this year. He was, of course, another first round pick back in 2022. But transitioning to the pass rush, this is, to me, one of the more underrated. Obviously, when you think of, elite duos, you probably think of TJ and Alex, or even in Ohio, of course, with Miles and Za'Darius, and then even down in Cincinnati with Sam and Trey. But who do you think ends up with more pressures this year, Daniil or Will Anderson?
I think it's gonna be Will Anderson.
I do too.
I mean, very few people in the NFL overall had a higher pressure rate than him, right? He was a revelation as a rookie. I think the addition of Daniil Hunter was more so about maintaining the integrity of the rush overall, rather than bringing in somebody who could like outproduce Jonathan Grenard. Ironically, they kind of swap spots, right? The Texans had a little bit of an issue with Grenard last year. I mean, he was very productive, but he also freelanced quite a bit. And for a team that rushes four as much as the Texans do, they had like a bottom 5 blitz rate in the league, if I recall correctly. Did not blitz a whole lot. It was very much, we're going to drop 7, we're going to rush with 4, and we're going to get there with 4. If you have Jonathan Grenard freelancing a little bit and opening up lanes of escape for a quarterback because you're not maintaining proper levels of a rush, I always like to describe a good pass rush like a zipper, right? Like the teeth should fit together. You should have a rusher at about a 9-yard depth. You should have a rusher at about a 6 to 7 yard depth. And you should also have guys compressing the pocket. Or if you're doing like a 5-man rush, like a fire zone or something, you should have something spiking into the middle of the pocket to kind of add that little compression as well. And if you have 2 out of those 3 levels, that means you're providing a lane of escape for the quarterback. And Grenard too often would spin when he shouldn't spin inside, or, he would he had this really nice, ghost move that he would use off a stab, but he would take it super deep. He would take it like to a 10 or 11 yard depth and then allow the quarterback to step up and then kind of squeak out the side. And that bothered the Texans. It's like, you're really productive, but good Lord, please maintain the levels to our rush overall. Like, we cannot have too many guys at one level leaving lanes of escape. And Daniil Hunter is very disciplined. If you go back to when he was in the Mike Zimmer defense, something that I really admired about that defense, back in the day, was they were very, very disciplined as a unit in terms of having every level of the rush maintained. I think I did a video on that. Like,
you did. I was going to reference it.
7 years ago.
The layerings with Evan.
The layering of it, right?
Right.
And that's what the Texans want. So that's why they brought in Daniil. And Daniil is literally there to set up the pins for Will Anderson. That is his job. So yes, Will's going to get most of the production, but I do think that Daniil, his level of importance should not be understated, because this defense will work because he is there.
So within that, off of that, one of my concerns with the Texans, and I'm eager to hear what your concerns with the Texans are, because this is a very complete team, and I don't think anybody would have thought that they'd be this far along 365 days ago. But one of my concerns for the Texans are are corners outside of Stingley. I think there's an immense amount of pressure on Okudah and Kamari and Mike Ford and everybody else. So what is your biggest concerns with the Texans this year?
They do have a young secondary, right? I mean, Stingley's going into his 3rd year, but he doesn't have as many games played as some other, younger corners around the league, because again, he missed time due to injury. So I still qualify him as a young emerging corner. Obviously you got Kamari Lassiter, who's a rookie, who I think is going to get significant play time. You do have Kalen Bullock, who's a rookie free safety, who I think, because he provides a different skill set than a lot of the other safeties on this roster, as like a true, like, rangy post safety, we're going to stick him back there in the deep middle and say, go get the ball. I think he's going to get significant play time, because if I'm willing to bet anything, it's that they want to play more cover 3 this year. They couldn't really do it last year because they didn't have a good enough a true free safety to do it. So there's a lot of youth there, and they don't do a whole lot of exotic things. Like, it's not very much like a say like a Spagnuolo defense in Kansas City, where dudes are they're going all over the place, right? Crazy angles. They're running cover 2 out of stuff that you would never imagine running cover 2 out of. You got nickels that are on the line of scrimmage and then hauling ass 30 yards deep to get to their deep half, right? They don't do that. They kind of play it straight. But the fact that they do play things straight, it's 4-man rushes, it's simple coverages. Simple coverages still have a lot of adjustments based on what you're seeing, right? Based on formations you're getting pre-snap, whether it's, after motion or if there's no motion, like you still have to know every single adjustment. Because if you're going to play something simple, you better have in the back of your mind your answers for everything that you could get. And that's how communication issues happen, right? So especially with young players. So if they're going to be a cover three heavy team, and they're going to try to do like a Legion of Boom style defense, Legion of Boom worked because they didn't make mistakes. They played the same thing over and over and over again, and people threw everything they possibly could at it, and they didn't make mistakes because cover 3 has a ton of adjustments. So that's my number one concern, is just getting these guys on the same page so that no matter what, gets thrown at them by, Chicago in week 2, they're going to be ready for it.
So I'm actually glad you brought up the Chicago game in week 2, because we're going to discuss the schedule a little bit, not break down all 17 games, but a little bit. But they start with Indy in week 1 versus AR. As a Texans fan, and the Colts you've dealt with the Colts for a lot of your life. I've dealt with the Packers. I get it. But who do you think the Texans' biggest threat is entering the year?
Oh, it's got to be Indy. It's got to be. Because you play them twice, you're fighting them for the division crown. You got to deal with them if you want a home playoff game, right? And I don't think people are prepared for what Anthony Richardson is about to do this year. Like, I'm telling you folks, that kid's different. And when you package him together with the receiving core that they've got, because they took A.D. Mitchell because
he was a beast.
Because of course they did, right?
Right.
He's just there. They're like, whatever. Well, you're just going to give him to us, fine. But also you got Shane Steichen. You got an offensive line that I think is really talented and very underrated. Obviously, you have a very talented backfield. The defense isn't like amazing. Like, they've got holes in the defense, but it's good enough, right? And you've got a freak of nature 255-pound quarterback that can throw it or run it and be pretty darn good at both. Like, that's a complete team. Like, I think Indy is a playoff team. I think they are a potential runaway freight train. If Houston doesn't keep up with them. So, like, they got to deal with it. I would imagine both of those teams are going to be in the playoffs, and we might even see them play each other 3 times this year.
I think my biggest concern, or not concern, I guess, but what I would be afraid of especially is not just for the Texans, but anybody that plays the Colts, is if they get up on you, if they get up 10 points quick because you can commit a turnover, or even 14 points off rip. I mean, you are battling back against a team that has Anthony Richardson and Jonathan Taylor, and just that offensive line running downhill at you for most of the afternoon. And that, to me, it's downright frightening. Whatever you think of AR as a quarterback, as a passer in this league, the idea of that is extremely, extremely frightening to me. But one other question that I did want to ask is, which rookie are you most looking forward to playing this year, and why?
Ooh, that's a good one.
For me personally, I'll go first because I kind of put you on the spot. I'll put you on the spot.
I'm deciding between a couple DBs here, so I'll let you go first.
For me, it's Kamari Lassiter. I don't like straight up like dogging a 22-year-old prospect, and I know you don't either, because it's not like I just don't think it's really ethical to like, oh, this kid sucks. Like, but I wasn't the biggest fan of Kamari. I don't think he sucks. I was just a little lower on him than a lot of people were. I had him around, I want to say like 70 on the big board, the final big board. And I'm eager to see how he transitions to the NFL and how he transitions, with his lateral quickness. Obviously, Kamari's not going to be in the cover 3. He's not going to be playing the deep third, and he's not going to be in a foot race with Adonai Mitchell. That would be quite literally setting him up for failure. But
not a good idea.
Right. So I am eager to see how D'Amico deploys him, especially early on, and how he transitions to the league.
He's got really good feet and he's got really good hips, and he's going to live and die by that, right? His game was never predicated on makeup speed. His game was predicated on, I'm not going to be out of position to have to make up ground anyway, right? and he's going to use his physicality to try to level the speed playing field. And there's been plenty of corners that have succeeded with that kind of playing style, especially in the type of defense that we expect they're going to play, which is very cover three heavy, just all different flavors of it. The one difference, well, not the one, I would say the biggest difference that you see with cover three heavy teams these days, even if you're looking at like Gus Bradley and Indy, right? Or Dan Quinn, I would say the biggest difference that you see is teams are still playing it a lot, but they're starting out in two high looks, and they're either going to play three strong or three weak, depending on who they want to rotate. And sometimes that rotation is determined by strength of formation. Sometimes it's determined by motion. But if they're calling cover three, a lot of the times they just make that call and then they trust their safeties to get into the right rotation into it if we're bringing down left versus right. And so for that reason, I'm really curious to see Kollmann Bullock. Out of all the rookies, I would say I'm most intrigued by him because we know he can do all the rangy post safety stuff. And I think a lot of people are going to default to thinking he's going to be the one that's always rotating deep. And with that, I think you're going to see teams test them early by running that direction, right? Running away from the rotate or running with the rotation, I guess you could say. And sometimes teams struggle to handle the run if you catch them in that kind of rotation where otherwise there might be a safety coming down to fill from a 12-yard depth. If he's all of a sudden rotating back to the post and you catch them in a good angle, you get on that three technique, it could open up a pretty sizable hole. So they're going to have to rotate him down into the box to kind of keep things from being too predictable. And when that happens, when they run into him being the safety that's rotating down, I'm curious to see how he holds up, right? Because he was never known as somebody who's going to be like a super aggressive physical run defender. So he will be tested early in that regard. That's probably the thing I'm most looking forward to seeing is not just all the Earl Thomas stuff that we know he can do, but can he also do the Cam Chancellor stuff and, take on a guard and not get murdered? Like that's my thing I'm looking forward to.
And I like that pick a lot. And also with Bullock, I want to say missed tackles. It was an insanely high rate last year at which right. So I really like that point with the rotation and then with him coming down because I would not feel comfortable with him as the last line of defense when the running back, especially if somebody like Jonathan Taylor gets going or Travis Etienne just gets going and it's one-on-one with him and he's the only guy in the backfield. So my next question kind of transitions to a young player on the defense for me. My breakout player, and I'll ask you yours. My breakout player for the Texans this year is linebacker Henry To'oTo'o. I liked him. I liked him a lot coming out of Alabama. Thought he had a solid rookie year, all things considered. Not every player's expectations are the same, but I thought Henry really outproduced what was expected from a fifth-round rookie last year. And obviously, he's not going to be talked about a lot in the 2023 Texans class for obvious reasons, but I thought he was pretty solid last year, and I think he's going to only get better this year.
I'm fascinated to see how they use him, right? Because this is potentially a team that's going to be spending a lot of time in nickel. Because it's potentially a team that's going to be very good offensively, and other teams are not going to want to stay in 12 and 21 personnel all day long. So I don't know how many snaps he's going to get because you also have Harris and you have Azeez Al-Shaair there, and he's not going to play over either one of them in my estimation. So he's going to be out there as like your likely third linebacker in like base 4-3 looks. But when they're out there and they're in that base 4-3 stuff, I think he's going to be really good at it. So I think he's going to be like a scalpel more than a hammer. You're not going to see him too much, but you're going to be damn happy that he's there when he is on the field. So I agree with you on that take. I just don't know how many snaps he's going to get just because this offense is going to be so good.
So then, like off that, who would be your breakout player for the Texans?
If I had to denote one, I would probably say Cade Stover, but not for the reason that you think, because I think this team is going to be, or I would even say Brevin Jordan too, whichever one, but they do different stuff. It's going to be the two tight ends that are behind Schultz, right? Because I think this team is going to spend a lot of time in 12 personnel. And Stover in particular, if you're looking at the types of blocks that he was really good at Ohio State, and again, this is a very niche answer. He's not going to be on the field that much either. If you're looking at the type of blocks that he was really good at Ohio State, as far as like backside cutoffs on zone, he was really, really good. And so I would anticipate that when they're in their 12 personnel stuff and he's on the field as either like an H-back or a move tight end, he's going to be opposite Schultz, who's going to probably be more of a Y for them. Maybe sometimes he'll be a big slot. He's going to be the guy who's handling backside cutoffs, and I think that he's potentially better at it than Brevin Jordan. So he's going to get more snaps than people think, specifically for that. And when we talk about the Texans' run game, it's not just about, okay, can they solidify their center guard trio and give Mixon room to work, but it's also, can the tight ends pull their weight as far as run blocking goes? And I kind of feel like that's why they took Stover, is specifically for that. And, oh, by the way, he's a quality receiver too. But, and again, hyper niche answer, very nerdy, degenerate answer.
I wouldn't expect anything less, to be honest.
But for my purposes, if I was a Texans coach, I would be really excited about him as a breakout TE2 on first down when we're trying to run the ball. Might only see it 10 times a game, but it's going to be important.
I wouldn't expect anything less, to be honest. That's I mean that the best way possible, by the way. But I do have a couple quick, well, actually one question, one quick one, and then three like rapid fire.
Sure.
Texans, Bears, week 2. Who are you rooting for?
I'm going to go with Texans because I've been a Texans fan longer. For people that don't know, I root for the two teams like where my dad lived when I was growing up, because he lived out there for work. And so he lived in Houston for a long time. So I didn't really care as much about the California teams growing up, which is ironic because I work for the Chargers now. But I latched on to the Texans in the early 2000s. And then he moved to Chicago in the loop. And I was like, well, they're in the NFC. And the Texans break my heart a lot. So surely the Bears won't also be awful to root for. So I latched onto the Bears as my NFC team. And every now and then they play each other. And it usually hurts me no matter what. I remember, it might have been 2012 at this point. Both of them were really, really good. And they played in the rain. It was like November. And they beat the absolute shit out of each other in this game. Like Arian Foster put in yeoman's work that day in a rainy, messy, horrible game in Chicago in the fall. And both teams were so battered and broken that they started off really well, and then they just both completely fell apart down the home stretch. And so that, I think, was very enigmatic of my life as a Bears and Texans fan, that I can't even enjoy watching them play each other, because I know they're just going to beat the crap out of each other. And they're probably going to do it again this year too, because they're both very talented, very physical teams that will likely ruin each other's September. So I'm looking forward to that.
Well, I mean, as you know, I'm a Vikings fan, so look, it's gonna be a don't look ahead game for the Texans, because in week 3 the Darnold's coming for him. I'm just gonna leave it like that. But the quick rapid fire. These are just quick over-under questions. Over-under CJ Stroud 29.5 passing touchdowns this year.
Over.
Okay. I don't know how to ask this one, so I'll kind of preface it like this. Over-under, will the Texans, like between the divisional round of the playoffs and the conference championship, will they be preparing for a game that Sunday? Because if I say over-under divisional round, it's equal. So like that Wednesday, will they be preparing for a game?
As in, will they make it past the divisional round? Okay.
Yes. I don't know how to word that. I'm sorry.
Ooh, I'm at dangerous risk of this getting clipped, but I'm going to do it anyway. Yes.
Hey, I have them AFC Championship team ceiling, so I think it's definitely possible too. Next one, over under Stephon Diggs 999.5 yards.
Under.
Oh, okay. And then Tank Dell, last one, 999.5 yards for Tank Dell. Do they have 2 1,000-yard receivers, assuming Nico as well gets 1,000?
I think under for both. I think they have 3 guys that go over 900. I think Nico's the only one over 1,000 because Dalton Schultz is also going to be there. It's going to be – so I'm going to lay out the whole
I got you.
Right? So I think Stroud is going to be ultra productive. He's going to get a bunch of touchdowns because he's great in the red zone. but they're going to run the ball a lot in between the 20s. They're going to spread the ball out amongst all their receivers a lot. And then they're going to get in the red zone. If they're inside the 5, it's going to be Joe Mixon territory. So I think he also gets double-digit touchdowns. If they're outside the 5-yard line, it's going to be CJ Stroud time. So I think Dalton Schultz sneakily might be top 2 in terms of receiving touchdowns for them. 3 receivers over 900. Nico is the one being over 1,000, probably over 1,200. Bunch of rushing yards for Joe Mixon. Wouldn't be surprised if Stroud has a couple hundred rushing himself. It's going to be an offense that frustrates everybody in fantasy because they're never going to know who to play in any given week, and everybody's going to take turns being the guy. But overall, this is a top 5 scoring offense.
I mean, I can absolutely see it, especially coming off of the year Stroud did with virtually no run game due to a lot of things that were out of his control. But Brett, that is going to wrap it up. I appreciate you joining. And a lot of people guessed, I said I had a special guest for the Texans. A lot of people correctly guessed that it was you. So appreciate you joining. Appreciate the time.
Anytime, man. Thanks for having me.